and around the world. And we have a fantastic panel today to discuss some of the fiery issues in US-China trade relations. Again, you can find all their biographies in the online event program we emailed today, and it's also on our website. After I briefly introduce our panel, a reminder that their full biographies are in our event program that we sent around earlier today. Welcome to Andrew Grotto with Stanford University and the Hoover Institution, Peter Harrell, a non-resident fellow at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, Dr. Melanie Hart, Senior Director of the Global China Hub at the Atlantic Council, Dr. James Mulvenin, Chief Intelligence Officer at Pamir Consulting, and our moderator, my good friend Nova Daly, Senior Public Policy Advisor at Wiley Ryan LLP, and somebody who is frequently in my ear reminding me about which topics we need to be covering at WITA and the right speakers to get on. And very grateful to you, Nova, for your friendship and support. Thanks.
Absolutely. And Ken, I just want to make sure you can hear me. Yes.
I can hear you. I can see you now after that strange darkness that was enveloping you. I don't even want to take that as a metaphor for our discussion. So thank you for joining us, all of you.
Excellent. Excellent. Well, thank you very much, Ken, and thank you, WITA, for this opportunity to host this august and extremely accomplished panel to discuss hot button issues, China issues, how they involve national security, technology, and cyber. So while the United States and the rest of the world have, for the past weeks, been saturated with executive orders on tariffs and trade, DOGE, and the culling of the U.S. workforce, our eyes have been taken, at least momentarily, I hope, and only momentarily, away from what many here would agree is the greatest challenge to the preeminence of the United States as a global leader for innovation, peace, and the ideals of human governance. That challenge is China. So it's time to refocus on that challenge. And with this learned and experienced panel, I hope we can recapture some ground and focus. While this panel will be interactive at the end, it will be a little structured at the start because you need to hear and focus on what these folks have to say. I'm first going to turn it over to Dr. Melanie Hart to provide her insights regarding where and how the United States, the administration, and Congress, and even US states, should focus their attention, resources, and efforts to address China's aggressive, multifaceted, and global efforts to upend American technology, economic, and military leadership. Following that, I'm going to turn it over to Andrew Grotto and Dr. James Mulvenin for a deep dive on the hot button issues on China cyber. James is going to cover, Andrew Grotto is going to cover, James is going to cover and go first, focus on the most salient and destructive China threats. And then Andrew is going to then focus on the US policy responses. Wrapping this up, the more structured portion will be a discussion, will be Peter Harrell, who, given his very recent leadership positions, will provide continuity on what this next administration, this current one, must do to drive and implement solutions in the technology competition that we face with China. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to you, Dr. Hart.
Sure. I think, just to start the conversation off, the biggest challenge that I see is de-risking our supply chains where we have deep dependence on China and figuring out how to move the global economy toward a structure that's more diversified and more resilient. And, there's three big areas of wins that the US was achieving under the Biden administration that I really hope to see the Trump administration double down on, because winning is good. We want to see more of that. And I really measure winning in terms of deals. If you're moving supply chains, if you're seeking to reduce China reliance, that means you're undoing deals in China, and you need to be forming new deals elsewhere in those supply chains where you have some critical dependencies. So I'd just like to flag, three areas that have been going really well. One is critical minerals. Another one is the chip supply chain, and the third is financing through DFC. When we're competing with China to do deals around the world, we can't outcompete Beijing if the competition is who shows up with the maximum amount of cash, because Beijing can do cash in a suitcase really well. So what we need to do to prevail is to figure out, well, what's our benefit that China can't match? And in each of those areas, I think we've done that with great success. In critical minerals, the benefit the US has that China can't match is allies and partners. All of our allies and partners are as freaked out about China's critical mineral export controls as the US is. And we all benefit when any of us bring new deals online. If Australia brings a critical mineral project online, that's great for us. We can buy from them. If we bring one online, that's great for Canada. That's great for Australia. That's great for Europe. What we want, the objective is more critical mineral supply outside of PRC control. And the State Department launched the Mineral Security Partnership, which has 15 countries actively working together to bring their companies together, to pool financing, to go out, find critical mineral mines and processing projects and bring them online. And two big deals were announced last year as part of the MSP. One was a germanium project in the DRC with a Belgian partner. Another one was a graphite mine in Tanzania with ROK-based POSCO and Australia's BlackRock Mining. Deals means it's working. So I'd love to see the Trump administration double down, see if you can bring more deals online than the Biden administration did in critical minerals. On the chips front, our big advantage when it comes to the semiconductor supply chain is that the CHIPS Act is big and sparkly and attractive. And for partner countries, if their two options are being a part of the US-centric chip supply chain and having a lower value added place in a China supply chain, they will choose chips every time. The State Department was the one agency that Congress awarded some funding to support the international side of that supply chain. And State was doing a lot of work in Latin America and Southeast Asia and identifying where do we need some additional capacity with nations outside the US to supplement what we'll be doing here at home, particularly on downstream processing, for example. And State was making some very targeted investments to bring partners into that supply chain in Costa Rica, in Panama, in Mexico, in Vietnam, in the Philippines, and Indonesia. And where State showed up and brought partners into the supply chain, those same nations started pushing back on China. There's a reason Costa Rica told Huawei no thanks on the 5G front, because they had a better offer as being part of a centric supply chain. So double down, on that kind of funding and financing, small funding, small amounts of funding that can incentivize much bigger private sector investment in deals. And third and finally, DFC is just now hitting this tipping point where DFC is outbidding Chinese state banks and Chinese SOEs and winning deals that China wants that we're getting. DFC teamed up with Japan's investment bank to outbid a PRC company and acquire massive telecommunication networks in the Pacific Islands. That was a trilateral partnership, actually, between the US, Japan, and Australia. It worked. We won. DFC outbid a Chinese SOE for a shipyard in Greece. DFC showed up with financing and convinced Sierra Leone to rip up a contract they had with China to build an airport and instead do a smaller, more efficient, made more sense one with DFC financing. They figured out how to outcompete China. We want to really double down there. And just finally, all of that progress is currently on the potential chopping block with this big federal aid funding freeze. The CHIPS money is foreign assistance. Even when agencies aren't directly frozen, like DFC and Exim Bank, companies around the world are looking at those financing vehicles and they suddenly look a lot riskier and a lot less attractive as a partner, because now you're wondering if they're going to get turned off when you're right at that critical deal making phase. And so, make deals happen. We have the tools to do it. Let's see if we can double down in those areas.
Excellent. Thank you, Dr. Hart. That's fantastic. Dr. James Mulvenin, please let us know your insights into what's going on the cyber front.
Thank you, Nova. I appreciate being here. Of course, looking at the cyber element of all of this, to me, China and the cyber issue, again, as you said, for the last month or so has been a little bit in the background, but it is really the through line through many of the national security issues that we're talking about on this panel, particularly given the travel restrictions and the reduction of travel to China. It's now, of course, the primary vector for theft of American technology. It's now the primary vector for Chinese technology espionage. And it's also now the primary vector for attack and sabotage against US critical infrastructure. And if we've learned anything from the various typhoons, Volt Typhoon, Flax Typhoon, Salt Typhoon, Twill Typhoon, I must say I'm actually in agreement with former CISA director Jen Easterly that we need to stop focusing so much on industry code names and sort of call things for what they really are. But it shows that the China cyber issue in every domain of US power is not abating, but it's actually going much deeper. And in fact, I would argue that the Typhoon attacks actually show that we're in a very deep deterrence hole with respect to China, and it's just getting deeper. It is clear to me that neither the Chinese nor the Russians in this domain feel like they've found our pain point yet. And you can't simply declare that you have a cyber deterrent. You actually need to act upon it. And what the administration is going to struggle with is that there's really only two ways to establish stability in the cyber domain. One is deterrence through denial, which unfortunately, given the mesh nature of the global network, is really impossible. And all that you're left with really is deterrence through punishment, which is the idea of imposing costs. And I would argue that cyber is actually about to greatly complicate the US-China trade relationship, but now in a bidirectional way. Because previously, in the previous administration and other sort of contexts, we have not really responded forcefully to the typhoons. But may remember in Trump 1, NSPM 13, which was the document related to cyber operations, was actually much more aggressive, lowered the threshold for approval of offensive cyber operations. And so I predict that if they can go back down that road again, which they've given every indication they're going to, we're going to see a lot more offensive imposition of costs from the executive branch, which is then going to, of course, result in reciprocal tit for tat. But I think you're also going to see a continued, whatever term you want to use, differentiation, decoupling, friendshoring, in the information and technology communication area. For the simple reason that while it may have made sense at the height of globalization to really cluster the world's information and communication technology manufacturing inside China, it is increasingly, from a national security perspective, an increasingly terrible idea, if only because China is now the #1 cyber threat actor. So the idea of building all of your kit inside the same country that is the primary cyber threat actor to the United States really no longer makes sense. And so continuing those controls, which in my personal opinion, in China, you always point at your nose when you're talking about yourself. In my personal opinion, we did a very uneven job of actually enforcing the rules that came out. And I'd be very interested to find out in the coming administration how Mr. Kessler and other key people within the bureaucracy view those rules, view the enforcement of those rules, whether they're going to double down on them. But I think that the ongoing intrusions by the Chinese military and the Ministry of State Security into fundamental critical infrastructure in the United States doesn't give us the luxury really of pulling back on any of those controls, but really argues in a major way for reindustrialization on the side that Melanie was talking about a moment ago. And I'll give you one final example for all of the company people on the line looking to improve their Q2 number. If you read the CISA and NSA guidance about Salt Typhoon very carefully, there was one key thing that was missing. And that was the patch or the patches that you were supposed to apply to the vulnerability that allowed them to get into the system. And that's because it's not fixable. You literally have to rip and replace out billions of dollars worth of hardware from the core routing infrastructure of the tier one telecoms carriers in the United States. Now, you could look at that as a tremendous opportunity if you're a telecoms equipment manufacturer like a Cisco or a Juniper or somebody like that, because we just have to rip all of it out, root and branch, and replace it. It is simply not patchable or fixable. And so that vulnerability will exist for as long as that equipment is still in the network. And that has to be one of the very first things that the administration has to deal with.
James, that's excellent. Scary stuff out there on the typhoons, and at the cost of rip and replace. And I'm sure even getting into quantum and what that's going to mean in terms of point of the spear is going to be important. And Dr. Hart, thank you. That was exceptional. And the deal, we're going to talk about art of the deal. I can't wait to get to it. Anyway, I'm going to turn next to Andrew. Going to give some U.S. policy prescriptions, hopefully mentioning our NSA and getting them to be better point of the spear. But please fire away, Andrew.
Yeah, well, I think that this administration is inheriting a pretty formidable arsenal of tools from the Biden administration. The Cyber National Mission Force was elevated to a subordinate unified command under U.S. Cyber Command in December of 2022. The force was deployed last year more than 85 times, which is more than in the previous 6 years combined. That's a positive trend line. In January, the administration revised the cyber sanctions framework to give more power to the Trump administration to target hackers targeting critical infrastructure. Then you have measures like the FCC Equipment Authorization Program, the ICTS Supply Chain Rule. So there are some tools that the administration, kind of put the finishing touches on in the last year that this administration is going to be able to wield, and that's positive. What I hope this administration will do is really continue to focus on defense. That's still a weak link in our approach to cybersecurity. I would like to see, and I think this administration is probably best positioned to do it. I don't think we'll have another chance to do this anytime soon. Is to work with Congress to pass minimum standards for critical infrastructure on cybersecurity. As it stands now, we have multiple sectors across critical infrastructure that are not subject to minimum standards, water, for example, being one. And what's really important about this is that you have sectors like water that simply can't afford to pay for security because their margins are too thin. So I would like to see this administration work with Congress to pass minimum standards for critical infrastructure, for cybersecurity, and include provisions to help sectors with slim to non-existent margins pay for it. And why don't I stop there? I know we don't have a ton of time left, and I want to leave plenty of time for us to get into a back and forth of discussion. So back to you, Nova.
Yeah. Okay. Awesome. Thank you so much, Andrew. And just thinking broadly on all the things you said, it's like I just think about sort of deterrence, right? I mean, if you have a vulnerable water supply and infrastructure, what are the deterrents from an actor like China going after that in terms of the critical infrastructure that we have? I mean, is it like the nuclear arms race where it's so destructive if the offensive capabilities of one is so offensive to the other that they don't take that kind of forward-leaning action? Anyway, I'm going to turn it over to one of the great minds in policy and trade and cyber and technology, Peter Harrell, to give us his views on where we need to go and between the two administrations. Thanks, Peter.
Well, thank you, Nova, and thanks to WITA for inviting me to be on this panel. And it's great to be here with a number of distinguished colleagues I've known for several years. And I also want to thank all of you online for continuing to be interested in a panel on China. I sort of feel like all anyone wants to talk about today is like Canada tariffs. But if I actually look at the trajectory of what's going to matter over the next couple of years, China, I think, and the U.S.-China tech and economic relationship really is going to remain front and center and really matter both strategically and economically, even if we all get distracted by blow-ups of things that are in the news on any given week. And I want to start by saying that I think we are broadly likely to see a fair amount of continuity between the Trump administration picking up where the Biden administration left off, just as frankly the Biden administration picked up from Trump term one. And I think you saw that continuity from Trump to Biden the first time around on some of the issues that Melanie, for example, talked about, where actually CHIPS Act was first passed under Trump and then picked up by Biden, and saw continuity around critical minerals. And certainly, the new administration, as it settled in, has talked about, maybe revisiting some of the specific terms on chips and that kind of thing. If you look at National Security Advisor Waltz's history, if you look at Secretary of State Rubio's history, if you look at some of the other incoming officials, you really see officials who have talked a lot about the need for to invest in kind of critical supply chains, critical U.S. sectors as part of our competition with China. And while there may be some tactical differences in approach, I think you are going to see continuity in this view of we need to be investing in American technological leadership as well as in kind of American supply chain resilience. Similarly, I think you're going to see a fair amount of continuity, or certainly more continuity than discontinuity, on the steps that the new administration, as it settles in, is going to take to protect the lead that the U.S. has in a number of technologies. The Biden administration became a very active and aggressive user of export controls. I'm not sure, and I think it's a little early to know exactly where the Trump administration will diverge and build on, or, maybe tweak a little bit. But it has been notable to me that for all the consternation there was about the Biden administration's AI diffusion export controls in January, Trump administration has kept that in place, at least so far. And they could change it, I think, and amend it a bit. I think you are going to continue to see an aggressive focus on export controls. I'd also note and call out, in the kind of Trump administration building on things the Biden administration did, if you look at President Trump's day one trade executive order, there were a couple of provisions, a lot of the focus was on kind of the trade wars to come, but there were a couple of provisions in there that explicitly directed his administration to build on things the Biden administration had done. In particular, called on his administration to look at the outbound investment restrictions that the Biden administration had put in place and to determine whether there were additional areas to look at restricting investment. And similarly, that executive order called on the Secretary of Commerce, Howard Lutnick, once he gets confirmed, to take a look at what the Biden administration had done to limit the use of Chinese internet-connected cars here in the United States, and see if there are other products that should be restricted there. I think reflecting some of the cybersecurity concerns that Jim and Andrew talked about in their remarks. So again, building on. Where do I think there's going to be divergence? And then I'm going to come in a moment to where I think the X factor is. I think we're probably going to see, and are already seeing in some sense, the Trump administration obviously focusing more on use of tariffs than the Biden administration did. The Biden administration was really quite judicious in further increasing tariffs on China. It did increase tariffs last year, but in a very kind of targeted on strategic products ways. I personally think that President Trump is kind of more concerned than Biden was about China as an economic competitor. Biden was very concerned about him as an economic competitor, also very much as a strategic competitor. I think Trump is very, very, very concerned about China as an economic competitor. And so you're going to see more of a focus on these trade issues and tariffs, even as we continue to see a ratcheting up of the national security controls. And so, we obviously already have increased tariffs in place. There's been a kind of temporary pause on the changes to de minimis that were announced a week ago. But I think clearly we're likely to see an increase in tariffs much more so than we did under the Biden administration. I would also posit there's some decent chance over the next 3 to 4 years that we may begin the Trump administration to look at tariffs on Chinese-made components that are going into products that are built in third countries. I think that'll be an interesting and complex issue for all of us in the trade community to work through. And then finally, what's the X factor? The X factor with the Trump administration is always Donald Trump. So you can look and talk to many of the folks that Trump has brought in, whether Secretary Rubio or now National Security Advisor Waltz or others, and a very hawkish approach towards China. I think a very sort of control-oriented and hawkish approach. But Trump does love a deal, right? And that's just the reality of dealing with Donald Trump. And well, I think the lesson of term one, as well as an analysis of the practical realities of the relationship between the U.S. and China, is that a deal is going to be hard. There are just a ton of issues in the relationship that would need to be addressed. With Trump, you can't rule out some unexpected curveballs that might come into the relationship, and I think we all have to be scenario planning what those could look like. Even if our base case scenario is more tariffs, ratchet up some export controls, and maybe expand the investment restrictions. I'll leave it there.
Great stuff, Peter. Yeah, and I think we're pretty much we could pretty much expect the X factor to constantly hit us. Which will be always makes things interesting. So I'm very selfish, but I want to let the audience ask some questions. So please, if you have questions, please put them out there, and we look forward to them. But I am selfish, and so I really want to dig into some more topics with these fantastic panelists. Dr. Hart, I want to start with you. You had a very important role at the State Department addressing the issues we're discussing today. So what would be or has been your advice to Secretary Rubio? What would be it, Secretary Rubio, that is a must-do in addressing a need to rapidly secure or de-risk U.S. supply chains to reduce our dependence on China?
Sure. I mean, I'd go back to those three big areas I mentioned before, double down on what our advantages are. With critical minerals, it's got to be working with allies because we can't outcompete China on cash. With the CHIPS Act, keep the U.S. supply chain strong and look for those opportunities to pull partner nations in so that they are moving towards us instead of towards China. And make our financing, the U.S. government financing partnerships, a really attractive alternative. DFC has been pricing Chinese companies out because at the end of the day, when they're not frozen, a lot of countries see DFC as a preferential partner than the Chinese alternative. So, right now, my number one piece of advice would be whatever process you have underway to review all of the foreign assistance, put half the department on that to move it as quickly as possible, because every day that we are off the battlefield, China's just running the plates, man. I'm hearing from a lot of NGOs working out in the field that the CCP is starting to approach foreign governments and say, if the US isn't going to show up, why don't you talk to us now? And we've worked too hard to wedge into global markets to see that easily to Beijing. So my number one piece of advice would be, hey, whatever review needs to happen with assistance or any other U.S. policies, review away, but put a bunch of people on it and review fast, because while we're off the field, China's doubling down.
That's great stuff. Thank you, Melanie. And thank you for all your service. So going to Mr. Mulvaney. So James, back in the days, it's just, it's personal. Back in the days when I was running SIFI as the Treasury in the Bush administration, you were one of those outside folks, very few, that were brought in to sort of give a debrief on what was going on with Chinese technology and certain companies, especially Huawei. So since that time, what's your view? Have U.S. efforts to address, Huawei and other critical Chinese technology companies in terms of competition, has it been effective globally? Are we doing our job since we last spoke back then?
Well, Nova, I'm a proud graduate of the University of Michigan, and our national championship winning coach Jim Harbaugh, at one point in a halftime speech said, "We can't take our boot off their neck." And my fear on the Huawei issue is that we took our boot off their neck. And a lot of that had to do, and I was greatly frustrated by, the applications and the information that was passed to Commerce about the illicit fabs that Huawei was building around the country, where we were clearly showing that they were Huawei owned, Huawei affiliated, and they were able to basically work around a lot of the controls that we had put into place. But that being said, we also did a really good job through the plurilateral systems, I think, of breaking down some of the antitrust barriers between Western competitors in the 5G telecoms equipment space, which at least offers some of the opportunities that Melanie mentioned in her presentation, which is us finally being able to offer an end-to-end solution from base stations to handsets through the server infrastructure, so that Huawei and ZTE were not the only offering available to the global south and other places. And we have done a better job of pushing back on some of the pathologies of BRI so that it is a bit more of a level playing field. The administration's decision today about the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act notwithstanding, which was always a factor, frankly, in competing with Huawei in places like Africa. That being said, I think we did succeed in convincing core partners and friends and allies, particularly in the Five Eyes, to eliminate the Huawei elements out of their infrastructure. And my hope is that in the current congressional climate also is that we follow through on the refunding, the supplemental funding to the Rip and Replace program here in the United States, which until recently, I know it got into the NDAA, but until recently was beggared. And the tier 3 telecoms providers in the United States that had agreed to Rip and Replace were not being paid the money to do that. And so I think we've got to fix that problem at a very fundamental level. Otherwise, we ruin the credibility of the US government in telling these providers that they shouldn't use certain foreign equipment in their network.
That makes a lot of sense. And it's expensive to rip and replace whole systems out there. So
yeah.
Awesome. Andrew, so I'm going to turn to you next. So you had an important role at the National Security Council, very important role, addressing the issues that we're discussing today on cyber. So what would be your advice if you were back in your chair at the NSA to NSA Waltz that the White House must do in addressing Chinese espionage and our government and private sector cyber resilience?
Yeah, I mean, it's pursue an integrated approach, right? Use all the tools of national power. And, that requires, obviously, having good people in place at the NSC, bringing the right staff in. It requires, conducting an inventory of what comprises that toolkit, knowing what instruments of power you have at your disposal, and being realistic about what works and what doesn't work. But at the end of the day, you take an integrated approach, offense, defense. James alluded to this. That's the way to go. Oh, Nova, you're on mute.
Oh my God. Those little buttons you got to click on. And so what about our capabilities in terms of the NSA? I mean, I'd always, like, when I was in government, I always understood, like, had the advantage, we had the technology, we had the knowledge to have that cyber advantage. I mean, are those more money, more resources, personnel? What about that?
Yeah, well, I'll go back to the point I made at the beginning, which is, if I were him, I think going to Congress and, he's got this rare moment of opportunity with, both houses of Congress, getting Congress to pass baseline cybersecurity standards for critical infrastructure, including funding for those sectors that can't afford security, would be a huge deal for U.S. national security. Right now, for example, U.S. Army installations around the country all rely on local critical infrastructure for service provision. water, electricity, rail. Many of those sectors aren't covered by minimum standards, and in some cases they can't afford it. That to me is still mind blowing. It was mind blowing, 10 years ago when I was senior director for cyber policy. It's still mind blowing when I teach my students at Stanford this. They're like, "Wait, what? Like, they're not subject to minimum standards?" I mean, it's baffling.
Yeah.
Well,
No, if I could make one comment on that. I
please.
always tell senior policymakers in the U.S. government, I said, the most powerful weapon in the U.S. government's arsenal is not the Trident D5 missile on the Ohio-class submarine. The most potent weapon in the U.S. government arsenal is actually the federal acquisition regulations. And that if you couple the federal acquisition regulations with raising the floor on NIST standards for that acquisition, you can actually change entire industries overnight. Because the information and technology, communication technology industry is not going to want to build products to one set of standards for U.S. government contracts and then other standards for consumers. It's going to raise the sea is going to raise all the boats. Now, I'm not sure in this current regulatory environment whether that is a good idea, but that is a relatively easy way. As someone who's speaking from a defense industrial based perspective, where we have to adhere to all of those new standards, we had to wholesale modernize our entire infrastructure to comply.
Yeah, that's a powerful lever. It's interesting. I've had this project with the U.S. Army for the last few years on critical infrastructure around Army installations, and one of our findings so far has been that the operational technology that critical infrastructure relies upon is not subject to nearly the same level of rigor and procurement regulations that the desktop PC and the cloud services are. And so that's a gap that exists that, for example, this administration could fix, with the proverbial stroke of a pen. Although, as you all know, amending the DFAR, the Defense Federal Acquisition Regulation, is not easy to do, but it is well within the reach of a national security advisor if you wanted to make that happen.
Awesome. I might want to come back to both of you on whether the U.S. has been a little too defensive and needs to be a little bit more offensive. But I want to turn it to Mr. Harrell, Peter. You are one of the great architects of really thinking about and addressing the outbound investment regime in terms of money flowing to technologies and companies where that was actually going to be harmful to the U.S. government. So, in terms of where we are today, and what needs to be done with that program? What needs to be done broadly? Should we expand it? What needs to happen there so we're really addressing the root of money getting into these companies that are big competitors with the United States and providing that technology to the military?
Yeah, so Nova, that's a great question. One I know you've done a fair amount of thinking about as well, going back to your time at CFIUS and then since. And I think there are really probably two big strategic choices the Trump administration is going to face on the outbound regime and where they want to take it. The first big strategic. So first let me begin. For those of you who sort of aren't deeply versed in the details the way some of us have had to be, the Biden administration's outbound investment regime applies to private investments. So things like venture capital, private equity investments, greenfield investments, in a handful of high-tech sectors in China, semiconductors, quantum computing, and parts of artificial intelligence. It doesn't apply to buying publicly traded securities of Chinese companies, even if that Chinese company might be involved in one of those sectors. So I think there's first going to be a question for, will the Trump administration expand the set of sectors there? And I think you've seen from some of the guys in Congress and some others, some desire to see those sectors expanded to maybe cover some additional defense-related sectors, maybe some additional high-tech sectors. So I think that's going to be their first strategic question. Do we grow the number of sectors that are covered there? And I think that's probably what the day one executive order kind of direction to Treasury Secretary Bessent is getting at. The other big question that's come up a lot in the public debate about the outbound regime is how to deal with publicly traded securities of various Chinese companies. And at the end of the first Trump term, the Trump administration created this list called the Chinese Military Industrial Companies Sanctions List that kind of names a bunch of Chinese companies, and Americans can't invest in those companies. And the Biden administration kept that list, reformed it a little bit, but largely kept it static. And I think there's going to be a really interesting question for the Trump administration of do they get back to growing that list, sort of putting more publicly traded Chinese companies on the you know, kind of US do not invest list. And that could be, if you look at the proposals that have been kind of out there floating around town from the Hill that some of the folks in the Trump administration have thought about before they went in, that could be simply like growing that list because we're concerned about more companies. It could also be by saying, for example, that companies that are on the Commerce Department's export control list, on the entity list, by and large, all get added to this do not invest list as a way of kind of harmonizing some of these different lists that we see across the US government. I don't know where they'll go. Obviously, the Trump team is dealing with a lot of issues right now on the kind of foreign policy space and geoeconomic space. But I do think by sort of late this year, we're going to see the Trump administration get serious about amending and expanding the outbound investment regime. And it's really just going to be a question of how far they go.
That's great stuff. Dr. Hart, one of the things I really found interesting in your testimony before the Senate Foreign Relations is dealing with the states, the U.S. states themselves. I mentioned it in sort of opening. What's your views? I mean, what are U.S. How can U.S. states help us and all the federal government be ready to address and deal with this competition? I love the deal side of it too, but if you don't mind just jumping in there, and then I'll see if there's any questions on the outside that we can hit.
Sure. I mean, so we have to keep in mind that a lot of state and city governments, they don't have China experts on staff. You know, there are, at the city level in particular, there are a lot of state and city governments that need help figuring out exactly what their local level China policies need to be. So the State Department's been doing a great work there with the subnational diplomacy unit and briefing them and helping state and city governments trade information with one another, track where there may be some growing risks. I think the number one thing that we need to see when it comes to competing with China and understanding where China is across the state and city subnational level is a lot more information flow from Washington out and then back to us. A lot of that's just been happening kind of in limited ways from the FBI that kind of isn't necessarily targeted to what some of the subnational leaders need. So we first of all, my first ask would be a lot more information flow where Washington can help provide the expertise they need to understand where there are risks. For example, vetting a Chinese company that shows up and is promising a lot of jobs. That happens. And if you are facing high unemployment and economic issues, it's hard to say no. You don't always have the information you have for due diligence. So we can do better from the DC side. I think the State Department subnational diplomacy unit was getting there. They provided over 80 briefings to state and city governments to help them make good decisions. That's great. We need more of that.
Awesome. Ken, I just want to make sure I'm not overextending the invitation by WITA and the graciousness of the timing of this, but should we hit any other questions? Do we have time or
we're sadly out of time.
Oh.
We had a lot to pack in here. Really grateful to all of you. It's a really in-depth discussion, important issues for our members to hear from experts about. There's so many things I think that the American people and even people who are very active in the trade community don't understand or don't know about. And we will continue to try to educate about these issues. Many of you, Melanie, Peter, Nova have been regulars on the WITA platform. Very grateful to you, Peter. We have collaborated on several bigger and smaller topics. Andrew and James, it's a pleasure to have you both on for the first time and hope to have you back again. We'll be discussing a lot of these issues over the months and years to come, and very grateful to all of you for all the questions that have come in.